And can you describe, I think a lot of us know or we think about it, but what are the ill effects that you've noticed in kids that use too much technology?
I mean, if we look at this like an onion, the outer layers of the onion, first and foremost, and we know now that the devices and the platforms are baked to be habituating. We've pulled back the curtain in The Social Dilemma and some of the other documentaries. Some of the repentant big tech moguls have admittedly said, Sean Parker, the first president of Facebook, had said, look, this is addiction by design. This wasn't some accidental byproduct. So the big tech folks knew very well that to best monetize their products, they had to increase engagement. Engagement was the name of the game, and engagement was all about using really sophisticated behavior modification techniques to make their platforms habit forming. So there's a dopamine reward loop that happens. So, we like the little dopamine tickle that comes when we get likes or when we level up in gaming platforms or when we get that validation that happens when we get that stimulation. So the price of admission to this digital world is habituation. And then part two is, what does that habituation lead to? What are the psychological byproducts of that habituation? And so clearly depression is the first most obvious one, and we're seeing the younger cohorts, the younger, more connected the generational cohorts are, the higher rates of loneliness and depression that are reported. And so to me, what was really fascinating was when you looked at the generational cohorts, starting at baby boomer and Gen X and millennials and Gen Zs, as you got younger and younger, you started getting significantly higher and higher rates of psychiatric unwellness. And the younger you were, the more plugged in you were, the more depressed and reportedly lonely you were. There was a loneliness epidemic happening. 1 out of 5 millennials saying that they don't have one friend. And when you go up the ladder with baby boomers, people were much more socially connected. And that went counter to the narrative, right? Because the Kool-Aid that we were being sold was social media for social species. It should have been this amazing thing. It should have been like chocolate and peanut butter, a wonderful combination. But in fact, we saw that the opposite was happening. It was an illusion of connection. And so people started realizing that we weren't evolutionarily designed to be sedentary, screen staring, isolated, not face-to-face communicating. And what really was the proof of concept of really the sky is falling when I wrote Glow Kids in 2016 was COVID. COVID brought everybody indoors, quarantined, and screen dependent. Screen time doubled and depression tripled during COVID.
Wow.
And so we started seeing that these effects were really pretty significant. And then beyond depression, there was developmental issues. If you were giving a child at those really key milestones, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, from 2 to 12, highly immersive and interactive and dopaminergic screens, we were seeing clear research that was showing the ADHD effect, that we were creating a generation that was going to become attentionally challenged. So we've seen spiking rates of ADHD because we've overstimulated young kids during key developmental ages. So as you know, the best thing for children developmentally is hand-eye activities, building blocks and working with their hands to be able to not only develop those neurosynaptic pathways that develop those skills, but attention, like language, is a developmental window. And when you start flooding those children's developing brains with the bells and whistles of hyper-immersive and hyper-stimulating screen time, you now create a profile of a young person that becomes stimulation dependent. So a lot of parents that I work with are like, oh, Johnny doesn't have ADHD. When he's on his computer, there's laser focus. But then when, the old thing is take away the computer and Johnny's literally bouncing off the walls. So it was depression, it was ADHD, it was anxiety levels. The screen, even though it was a stimulant, also had a sedating effect, a hypnotic effect. So now you started having kids and young people and adults who were using screen time to self-soothe, to kind of calm them down. And again, like any benzodiazepine, you can get overly dependent on it. So now without the screen, you can't calm down. And finally, were the mind-shaping aspects of technology, depending on how young you were. Now what we're seeing is, pretty large spikes in personality disorders, like borderline personality disorder. Clearly, we started seeing also some psychiatric social contagion effects where in the influencer world of digital media, which is the world that our young people are living in, that's their social environment, is the digital world, you really started seeing really, really popular psychiatric influencers, the dissociative identity disorder crowd and borderline personality disorder influencers on TikTok. The TikTok Tourette's phenomenon, where literally billions of views for 3 or 4 TikTok influencers that had Tourette's syndrome. And then you started seeing that their followers, typically adolescent females, started now consciously or unconsciously mimicking some of their psychiatric distress. So these were the multifaceted impacts that were happening, all at once in this mass experiment that we've been conducting.
It really hit home when you talked in your book about the dopaminergic effects that screens are having on our brain, that it acts similarly as anything that we really crave as rewards, like eating a lot or sex or any engagement that drives humans to feel reward, that screens are similar, even more so, correct?
Yeah, I think what woke up a lot of people was there was really clear fMRI brain imaging research that really started showing your brain on screens looked exactly like your brain on drugs did. So the dopamine reward is it's the neurotransmitter that's most associated with any kind of addictive disorder. And typically we tend to associate that the more dopamine activating or dopaminergic any kind of experiences, any kind of substances, the higher the potential for addiction. So things like craving foods like chocolate have a 50% increase in dopamine. Sex has a 100% dopamine spike. Cocaine has a 300% dopamine spike, and crystal meth has a 1,300% dopamine spike. And that tends to correlate with how potentially habit-forming they are. Now, there's a lot of different addiction ideological theories. There's also genetics. So some people are predisposed towards liking that dopamine tickle more than others, potentially, depending on childhood variables, trauma, or genetics. But certainly the culprit is how dopamine activating some of these experiences or substances are. And what they found was that screen time was right up there with a sexual experience. It was 100% dopamine activating. Excuse me. And this was a study back in 1998 by Dr. Cope in Nature magazine, and it showed 1998 video games, which were yesterday's generation of stimulation. This was like not quite, Pong or Pac-Man, but it wasn't Grand Theft Auto either. They were as the dopamine activating as a sexual experience, except worse, that because people were able to engage in these platforms for hours and days. I've had clients who were involved in these different experiences for multiple days at a time. So the dopaminergic effect was exacerbated because of the length of time that people were playing it and were on them. The brain imaging research that was also really clear that a lot of people also saw was that you saw frontal cortex abnormalities that mirrored substance addiction. So you saw a shrinkage in the gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, which is our decision making, and the prefrontal cortex is our executive functioning. It's what allows us to not be impulsive. It allows us to do the if-then thinking. And anything that shrinks that part of your brain makes you more vulnerable towards impulsivity. So chronic substance abuse is a double whammy, because if you're addicted to a substance, the more you use the substance, the more your ability to just say no to the substance gets compromised, because your decision-making center is compromised. Well, we saw the same thing happening with screen time. The decision-making centers of the brain were physically shrinking. It was called decreased DGM. The dense gray matter of the brain was physically shrinking as a result of screen time. And most people had a hard time understanding that, because you're not ingesting anything. How is it neurophysiologically affecting us? But of course, we know that things affect our brains that we don't have to just swallow. Trauma affects the brain. Our experiences affect our brain. And this was one of them.
And I can see it. I mean, I see myself, like, there's such a pull to look at my phone. And I think I didn't have a phone until, the last 10, 15 years. And I think about my children. How are they going to focus on their homework if they have the pull of a screen next to them? I mean, I had a hard time in high school staying focused, writing essays, doing my homework. how are children these days going to do what they need to do with that strong pull towards the digital world? I feel bad for them.
That's a good way to look at it. We need to ask ourselves if we, as the adults in the room who have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, because as you know, that part of our brain develops fully in our mid-20s. So here we are ostensibly with fully developed brains, both of us. And we have, I know I have a hard time with my phone. Its gravitational pull can be very strong. So how do we expect the 7-year-old or the 8-year-old to be able to moderate that usage? That's the problem. We don't fully grasp how problematic this may be for people. And a lot of folks who aren't parents, they see things through the lens of their own experience, and they don't really grasp that, when the child is really vulnerable, they don't have the neurophysiological hardware to moderate or to manage. And so you're setting up a kid for failure when you're trying to set, especially at very young ages, when you're trying to say, well, only have your hyper-arousing sexual, the equivalent to sex device for only 30 minutes, and then just stop. And just put on the brakes at 30 minutes. It's almost impossible. So yeah, we need to understand that through our own lens, again, by appreciating how tough it is for the adults to be able to manage some of these things.